Black mail-order bride rejected for her color, until a mountain man saw her as his perfect. The train hisses into a frozen frontier town. A young bride steps off, dressed in her Sunday best only to be spat on, shamed, and rejected in front of everyone for the color of her skin. The church bell tolls. The sheriff turns his back. Doors slam shut. But then from the crowd, one weathered mountain man steps forward. Scarred by war, hardened by winters, he dares to see what no one else will, her worth. He calls her perfect. Together, they light a fire in a world that wants to snuff them out. Yet whispers rise in the saloon, a hidden deal, a stolen spring, and an arsonist's torch waiting in the night. As smoke fills the sky and jail keys rattle, hearts are tested by fire. Will the frontier break them apart? Or will faith and courage forge a love strong enough to change an entire town? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted train platform as Michelle stepped down from the eastbound car. Her Sunday dress rustled in the crisp mountain air as she clutched her worn Bible close, drawing strength from its familiar leather binding. The Colorado Highlands stretched endless and white behind the scatter of wooden buildings, beautiful but forbidding. The widowed rancher who'd written such promising letters stood waiting with several townsfolk. His face twisted as he looked her over, taking in her appearance with growing disdain. "This ain't what was agreed to," he spat, turning to address the gathering crowd rather than Michelle directly. "Can't have someone like her running a respectable ranch house." His emphasis on her carried all the spite Michelle had learned to recognize since childhood. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Women drew their shawls tighter and stepped back. Men's faces hardened or looked away. The hotel keeper, a thin man with a waxed mustache, shook his head firmly when Michelle approached his establishment steps. "We don't take your kind here," he said, blocking the entrance. "Try the next town over." Sheriff Pike pushed through the growing crowd, thumbs hooked in his gumbelt. His badge caught the winter light as he cleared his throat. "Ma'am, best you catch the next train out. Sundown's our deadline for visitors like yourself." His words were polite enough, but the warning beneath them was clear as ice. Michelle's hands trembled slightly on her Bible, but she held her head high. The platform boards creaked behind her, and a tall figure emerged from the press of bodies. David McGraw moved with the deliberate grace of a man used to rough country, his scarred face weathered by sun and wind. Without ceremony, he lifted her carpet bag from where it sat beside her skirts. "I'll see you safe," he said, voice quiet but carrying easily across the sudden hush. His calm words held no challenge, yet they somehow made the jeering onlookers seem small. Together they walked past the livery stable, its rough-hewn walls dusted with snow. David spoke briefly with the stablemaster, and soon they had a sturdy mule for her carpetbag and a spare horse for Michelle. The grade ahead looked steep, winding up into the white-capped peaks dot as the weak winter sun began its early descent. They followed the creek's frozen course. Their mounts' hooves crunched through crusted snow, and their breath steamed in the thinning air. David kept a respectful distance, but shared his tin of coffee when they paused to rest the animals. "The town back there," he said, pouring the hot liquid carefully into the tin cup's lid. "They're wrong about you. I see a woman of dignity, of faith." He passed her the makeshift cup. "If you'd allow it, I'd court you proper. Give you time to know your own mind." Michelle wrapped cold fingers around the warm metal, studying this quiet man who had stepped forward when all others stepped back. His eyes held steady on hers, honest and direct. Here was someone who saw her as she was, not as others wished to label her. "I'd like that," she said softly, and meant it. The last rays of sun were fading when they reached David's line shack. It was a sturdy structure of squared logs, with a stone chimney that promised warmth within. David lit the lamp just inside. The door and golden light spilled across rough-hewn walls that somehow seemed to welcome her. Michelle paused in the doorway, overwhelmed by the day's sharp turns from hope to despair to this unexpected sanctuary. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, feeling the truth of those words in her bones. Here, at last, was shelter from more than just the mountain cold dot through the small window. She could see the last colors bleeding from the sky, painting the snow-covered peaks in deepening shades of blue. The lamp's glow touched everything inside with warmth. The simple table, the swept hearth, the neat stack of kindling by the door. It wasn't the fine ranch house she'd imagined when answering that letter, but somehow this humble cabin felt more like the answer to her prayers. The sound of David caring for the horses drifted in from outside, steady and sure as his character had proven to be. Michelle touched the rough-sawn doorframe, feeling the solid reality of this place that had become her refuge. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she knew God's hand had guided her steps to this mountain, this moment, this man who had the courage. To see her true worth, David hung a thick wool blanket across a rope line, dividing the single room to give Michelle privacy. The lamplight cast soft shadows as he moved about the cabin, his actions measured and deliberate. He set a pot of beans to boil on the iron stove, the familiar scent filling the small space. "The bunk's yours," he said, gesturing to the narrow bed against the far wall. "I'll bed down here by the hearth." His voice was quiet but clear, carrying the same respect he'd shown since their first meeting on the platform. Michelle sat at the rough-hewn table, her Bible open before her. The cabin's warmth had begun to seep into her bones, chasing away the chill of that cruel morning. David stirred the beans, then turned to face her, his scarred features thoughtful in the flickering light. "You'd be perfect for a man who means to build a home," he said simply. "Someone who understands the value of what's being built." Michelle met his gaze steadily. "Dignity must come first," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "A home needs more than walls to stand true." David nodded, understanding in his eyes. They ate their simple supper in comfortable silence, the wind whistling through the cabin's chinks the only conversation. When dawn broke across the snowfields, Michelle was already awake. She moved quietly about the cabin, tidying the sparse furnishings and warming yesterday's biscuits on a cast iron skillet. The aroma of hot bread filled the air as she bowed her head. "Thank you, Lord, for this safe harbor," she prayed aloud, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. David, already up and tending to the horses, paused in the doorway at her words. Over breakfast, he laid out his plan. "We should ride to town," he said, breaking a warm biscuit. "Need supplies, and we can speak with Reverend Fellows. If you're willing, and when you're ready, he could marry us proper." Michelle considered his words carefully, appreciating how he left the choice in her hands. "That seems wise," she agreed. They set out as the sun climbed higher, picking their way carefully along the icy trail. David led the supply mule, while Michelle rode the spare horse, her skirts arranged modestly despite the awkward perch. The journey was slow, with David testing each patch of ice before letting the animals cross. The town looked different in the late morning light, its streets busy with daily commerce, but the welcome was no warmer than the day before. Hostile glances followed their progress down the main street, and women hurried their children to the other side when Michelle passed Dot at the general store. David laid out his coins on the counter. The shopkeeper's face twisted with displeasure, but money was money. He filled their order while glaring at Michelle, who stood tall under his scrutiny, her dignity a shield against his contempt. Sheriff Pike appeared as they were loading there. Supplies, his badge catching the winter sun. "McGraw," he said, voice low and warning. "Sheltering a trouble starter will cost you friends in these parts." David secured the last package before turning to face the lawman. "Already decided who my friends are, Sheriff," he replied evenly. "Reckon I can live with that choice." The sun was well past its peak when they started the journey back, shadows stretching long across the snow. Their conversation flowed easier now, touching on family, faith, and what makes a household fair and true. "My mama taught me that prayer holds a family together," Michelle shared, guiding her horse around the fallen branch. "That and treating each soul with the respect God gives them." David nodded, leading the mule with sure hands. "My pa always said a man's word was his bond," he replied. "Figured that applies double in marriage." When they reached the cabin, the wind had picked up, driving loose snow before it. They hurried inside, closing the solid door against the growing storm. Michelle began humming a hymn as she stored their purchases: flour, coffee, salt, and other necessities. The familiar melody filled the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire David was building. Near the hearth, David sat working on a cracked water bucket, his strong hands gentle as he sealed the split wood. The hymn Michelle hummed spoke of grace and shelter, of God's providence in times of need. Together in the lamplight, they had found something rare and precious, respect freely given, dignity honored, and the first tender shoots of hope taking root in frozen ground. The next morning dawned clear and cold. After a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, Michelle and David saddled their horses for another trip into town. Michelle carried her mother's Bible, its leather cover smooth from years of faithful hands. David rode beside her, his expression thoughtful as they followed the familiar trail. The parsonage sat behind the white-painted church, its windows gleaming in the winter sun. David helped Michelle down from her horse, then removed his hat as they approached the door. Reverend Fellows welcomed them into his study, a room lined with books and warmed by a pot-bellied stove. "I understand your intention," Fellows said, settling behind his desk. His fingers worried the edge of a letter, likely about the schoolhouse roof repairs his donors had promised to fund. "But under present circumstances, I cannot perform the ceremony. The community—" He trailed off, unable to meet their eyes. Michelle's fingers tightened on her mother's Bible, but her voice remained steady. "We seek God's blessing, Reverend, nothing more." "I'm sorry," Fellows replied, though his gaze stayed fixed on his desk. "I truly am." Outside, two men lounged against the church fence, their laughter cutting sharp as Michelle and David emerged. A stable boy mucking out stalls nearby echoed Rancher Tate's cruel words from the train platform. David's jaw tightened, his hand clenching briefly at his side, but he chose the better path. With gentle firmness, he guided Michelle toward the mercantile instead. The store bell chimed as they entered. While David gathered flour and candles, Michelle paused at a display near the counter. Among the sundries sat a small tin cross, simple, but beautifully crafted. Her fingers traced its outline without touching it. On a bench outside, an elderly Cherokee woman named Ahive watched through the window. Her dark eyes noted Michelle's straight spine, the grace with which she carried herself, despite the morning's hurt. When Michelle and David emerged from the store, the tin cross now wrapped carefully in paper, Ahive's weathered face showed quiet approval. David helped Michelle mount her horse, then stepped back. His voice carried clearly across the street, meant for all to hear. "If they won't see you, I still do. You'd be perfect for me." The words rang with truth and challenge both. Their return journey was slow, especially at the creek crossing. Ice crusted the ford's edges, requiring careful navigation. As their horses picked their way across, Michelle spoke softly. "I fear becoming a burden to you," she admitted, watching the water splash around her mount's hooves. "The town's hatred won't ease with time." David guided his horse alongside hers once they reached the far bank. "What I want is a partner," he replied steadily. Someone to share prayer and work, to build something true together. He looked at her directly. That's what I see in you. Twilight was settling over the hills when they reached David's cabin. Together, they led the tired animals into the stable, their movements falling into an easy rhythm as they removed tack and spread fresh hay. Inside the cabin, David banked the fire for the night while Michelle hung her mother's Bible and the new tin cross on the wall near her bed. The lamplight caught the cross's surface, making it shine like a star against the rough logs. Michelle touched it gently, remembering the morning's rejection but finding her heart oddly at peace. David's words in town had done more than answer Fellow's refusal. They had declared her worth before, God and man alike, through the cabins. Single window, snow began to fall, each flake catching the last light of day. The stable was snug, the fire warm, and despite the preacher's fear, despite the town's scorn, something strong and hopeful was taking root in this quiet place. Michelle whispered a prayer of thanks, her mother's Bible close at hand, while David added another log to see them through the night. Michelle woke, while stars still dotted the ink-black sky. The cabin's chill nipped at her nose as she slipped from beneath her quilt. Moving quietly so as not to wake David, who slept near the banked fire, she set coffee to boil in the battered pot. By the time pale light touched the eastern hills, the smell of fresh coffee filled the small space. Michelle's hands worked steadily, kneading dough on the rough wooden table. The familiar motions brought comfort, a reminder of mornings at her mother's side. David stirred at the sound of her work, rising to tend the horses and fetch water. After a breakfast of hot biscuits, David gestured toward the door. There's something I want to show you. He helped her into her coat, and they crunched through frost-covered grass, following a narrow path that wound behind the cabin. The spring revealed itself as a silver ribbon, bubbling up through a cleft in the rocky ground. Clear water caught the morning light, dancing as it spilled over stone. David pointed to a tin tag nailed to a nearby pine. My filed claim, he explained, his voice grave. Town's been eyeing it for stock water. There's talk of a railroad spur coming through, too. Makes this water worth more than gold to some folks. Michelle knelt beside the spring, letting the cold water run over her fingers. Is that why those men watched us in town yesterday? David nodded slowly. Reckon so. Some think a man like me shouldn't hold such a valuable claim. He left unspoken what they thought about Michelle. As the sun climbed higher, David taught Michelle how to set snares along game trails. His hands moved with practiced ease, showing her how to bend branches and loop wire. Michelle proved a quick study, her fingers nimble at the delicate work. Back at the cabin, Michelle settled by the window with David's old coat and her sewing kit. Patches of worn fabric gave way beneath her needle as she hummed softly, Amazing Grace. Then, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. The familiar spirituals filled the quiet afternoon with hope. The sun hung low when hoofbeats approached. David tensed, recognizing the sound of multiple riders. 3 men appeared around the bend, led by the rancher who had rejected Michelle at the train platform. Their horses' breath steamed in the cold air. Getting mighty cozy up here, McGraw, the rancher called, his voice thick with mockery. Thought you had better sense than to take in strays. David moved toward the door, lifting his single-action Colt from its peg. Michelle's heart hammered as he stepped outside, but she saw his thumb rest carefully beside the hammer, keeping it down. Michelle's under my protection, David said, his voice carrying clearly in the winter air. And if God allows, she'll be my wife. That's all you need to know. The rancher spat into the dirt. Sheriff Pike's got opinions about troublemakers. Might be time he paid a visit. The threat hummed sharp as icicles between them. After the riders disappeared down the trail, David barred the door. Michelle's hands shook as she poured coffee into tin cups. I'm afraid, she admitted softly. David set his gun aside and sank into a chair. Truth be told, so am I. He reached for his Bible, worn and dog-eared. But I know where to take that fear. Together they bowed their heads. Michelle's voice steadied as she prayed for protection, for wisdom, for a way forward. David's deep amen mingled with the crackling fire. Tomorrow, he said, meeting her eyes, we'll find another way to marry. Put this home beyond their gossip. Michelle nodded, rising to stir the pot of stew hanging over the fire. They ate by lamplight, both straining to hear through the growing wind. But the night's only sounds were the howl of the storm and the pop of burning pine logs. David added wood to the fire, its light throwing long shadows on the walls. Michelle wrapped her shawl tighter and began to hum another spiritual, soft and low. The melody wove through the wind's voice until the two became one song, a prayer for strength, for justice, for love to overcome fear. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes catching the lamplight through the window. But inside the cabin, warmth held steady, and two hearts beat stronger for facing the storm together. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Michelle and David rode toward town. Frost sparkled on bare branches, and their horses' hooves crunched through patches of snow. They had risen before first light, determined to find answers about marriage requirements. The telegraph office sat between the mercantile and the bank, its windows still dark. They waited on the wooden steps until the clerk arrived, fumbling with his keys in the morning chill. Inside, the sharp scent of ink and paper filled the air as he consulted his documents. Marriage license must be filed at the county seat, the clerk said, adjusting his spectacles. 2 days' ride by stage, assuming the weather holds. He shuffled through more papers. Though most folks hereabouts have pastoral ceremonies first, make it proper with the county when they can. Michelle's heart sank at the news of the journey, but David's steady presence beside her offered comfort. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, the morning sun caught something metal, the small tin cross Michelle had admired yesterday in the store. Window, a soft voice called out behind them. A moment, if you please. They turned to see the elderly Cherokee woman from yesterday approaching, her shawl drawn tight against the morning air. She moved with deliberate grace, her silver hair catching the light. I am a hive, she said, her voice warm and clear. I serve as a mission preacher, trained by Cherokee ministry. She gestured to the wooden bench where she had sat yesterday. Please, join me. They settled on the bench, and a hive explained her offer. I conduct faith ceremonies recognized by our community. With proper witnesses and written record, it would honor both your beliefs and the law's intent until you can reach the county seat. Michelle felt hope rise in her chest. She looked at David, saw the same feeling reflected in his eyes. Together, they bowed their heads as a hive led them in prayer, her words bridging their different paths to the same God. By late afternoon, they gathered in a grove of towering pines beyond the town's edge. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the branches, dappling the snow-patched ground. The air held the sharp scent of pine needles and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Mrs. Ellery, a widow known for her quiet strength, stood as witness with her teenage son. Her practical frontier dress and warm shawl suited the occasion's simplicity. The boy stood tall beside his mother, understanding the importance of his role. A hive opened her well-worn Bible, its pages marked with colored ribbons. Her voice carried clearly through the grove as she read from 1 Corinthians about love's patience and kindness. She spoke of covenant, of promises made before God and community. Do you freely choose this path? A hive asked them each in turn. Do you vow fidelity before God and these witnesses? Michelle's I do rang with quiet certainty. David's deep voice echoed her words, his scarred hands gentle as they held hers. Without rings to exchange, David reached for his horse's mane. With careful fingers, He braided 3 strands of horsehair into a circle. Michelle did the same, the simple bands becoming symbols of their promise. Mrs. Ellery stepped forward with her son, both signing their names as witnesses in Hayhiv's mission record book. The afternoon light had begun to fade, turning the pine needles to gold. "We'll take the stage next week," David said as they prepared to leave. "Make it proper with the county, too." Mrs. Ellery squeezed Michelle's hand. "You've done right here today. Don't let anyone tell you different." Twilight gathered as Michelle and David rode home to their line shack. Inside, the familiar walls welcomed them with the promise of sanctuary. Michelle mixed cornbread while David built up the fire, its warmth pushing back the evening chill. They sat close together at the rough table, sharing the fresh cornbread and coffee. When Michelle began to hum, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," David's deeper voice joined hers. The hymn filled their small home, a prayer of gratitude and hope rising with the sparks from the fire. The simple bands of horsehair around their fingers caught the firelight, reminding them of promises made and a path forward built on faith, respect, and the support of those who chose to stand with them in truth. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. Michelle woke to find David had already stoked the fire and set coffee to boil. The simple horsehair band around her finger caught the early light, reminding her of yesterday's ceremony. Their first full day as husband and wife stretched before them, full of promise and work to be done. After a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, they tackled the day's task together. The spring lay a short walk from the cabin, water bubbling crystal clear. From a rock seam, they made several tricks, Michelle carrying the smaller bucket while David managed the larger one. Their breath frosted in the winter air as they talked about plans for the homestead. "Come spring, we could plant herbs near the door," Michelle said, settling her bucket carefully on level ground. "Save steps when cooking." David nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Reckon that's good planning." By mid-morning, they turned their attention to the roof. David steadied the ladder while Michelle handed up patches of tin and wooden shingles. The worst leaks were near the chimney, where winter storms had worked loose several boards. Working together, they sealed the gaps against future snow. After their noon meal, David brought out his Winchester rifle. Michelle watched as he demonstrated proper handling, his movements deliberate and careful. "Every gun's loaded until you check it yourself," he explained, showing her how to open the action. "Even then, never point it at anything you don't aim to shoot." Michelle paid close attention, learning to check the chamber of both the rifle and the single-action Colt. Though she chose not to fire them, knowing their workings eased her mind. "I pray we never need them," she said softly, "but I'm grateful to understand them." As evening approached, they sat close by the fire. Michelle opened her mother's Bible to Psalms, the familiar words bringing comfort. David listened as she read about still waters and restored souls, his rough hand resting gentle on hers. They discussed the garden they would plant when winter released its grip. Beans climbed well, Michelle noted, sketching plans on a scrap of paper, and squash spreads to shade the soil. Sunday morning brought a different rhythm. They rested from labor, taking time for extended prayer and reflection. Michelle copied favorite scripture verses into her journal, while David mended harness by the window. Together, they made a careful list for their upcoming county trip. Michelle wrote in her neat hand, warm wraps for the stage ride, jerky and hard biscuits for the journey, coins counted careful for their fare. David added the mission record book to their bundle, precious, proof of their commitment before God and witnesses. The afternoon sun slanted golden through the windows when Mrs. Ellery's knock sounded at their door. She entered bearing a fresh apple pie, its crust still warm from her oven. "Wanted to bring my proper congratulations," she said, setting the pie on their table. Her face grew serious as she settled in the offered chair. "But I ought to warn you, there's talk in town about your spring claim, David. Some men are mighty." Sour about it, especially with the railroad survey crew asking after water sources. David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Much obliged for the warning, Mrs. Ellery. We'll keep watch." After she left, Michelle and David shared pieces of pie in thoughtful silence. The afternoon passed quietly as they prepared for tomorrow's journey. Michelle tucked her journal beside the Bible on their small shelf, the leather bindings worn smooth with use. She folded their new quilt, Mrs. Ellery's wedding gift, and arranged their bedrolls, neat against the wall dot as Sunday's light faded. They laid out clothes for travel, Michelle's sturdy dress and shawl, David's warmest coat. The stage would leave early, requiring them to rise before dawn. 2 days' ride to make our marriage proper with the law, David said as they banked the fire for the night. Though it's proper already in my heart. Michelle touched the horsehair ring on her finger. "In mine as well," she said softly. "God has blessed us with a home already." The firelight cast warm shadows on the neat cabin, their shared home now, with its sheltered corners and simple comforts. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called. Inside, peace settled like a blanket around their shoulders as they prepared for sleep and tomorrow's journey. The first hints of Monday's dawn painted the eastern sky in pale strokes. Frost silvered the sagebrush, and a bitter wind whipped across the highland meadow. Inside their snug cabin, Michelle stirred the banked coals while David pulled on his heavy coat. "I'll saddle the mule and ride to Mrs. Ellery's," David said, adjusting his scarf. "Our wagon will make the trip to town easier. Should be back within the hour." Michelle nodded, already gathering their travel supplies. "I'll have everything packed and ready." David stepped out into the biting cold, his boots crunching on frozen ground. Michelle watched through the window as he led their mule from the lean-to shelter, saddled it with practiced motions, and tethered it near the cabin door. With a wave to her, he mounted and rode off, following the winding trail toward Mrs. Ellery's homestead. After latching the door, Michelle moved purposefully around their small home. She wrapped bread and jerky in clean cloth, tucked their marriage records safely in her carpet bag, and swept the hearth clean. The morning sun climbed higher, warming. The frost-rimed windows dot near mid-morning. A creaking sound drew her attention. Michelle peered through a gap in the curtain, expecting to see David returning. But the yard remained empty, except for the tethered mule shifting restlessly. The wind moaned around the cabin's corners. Then came the unmistakable scuff of boots on packed earth. Before she could move, the sharp smell of kerosene stung her nose. Heart pounding, she glimpsed shadows moving along the back wall through a crack between logs. A flash of movement, the scratch of a match. "Stop!" Michelle shouted, grabbing the water bucket. She yanked the door open just as flames licked up the outer wall. Without hesitation, she flung the water at the base of the fire. But more flames were already spreading, catching the dry wood like tinder. Smoke began seeping through the chinks. Michelle dragged their wool blankets outside, beating at the flames that crawled up the logs. Her eyes stung, and she choked on the thick smoke, but she kept fighting the blaze. "Lord, help us," she prayed between coughs. "Send David home." As if in answer, hoofbeats thundered across the meadow. David galloped into view, his face tight with alarm. The wagon axle cracked. He called out, leaping from the saddle, "Michelle!" He burst through the smoke, snatching up his heavy coat. Together they beat at the flames, smothering them against the charred logs. Just as the fire began to die, movement flashed in Michelle's peripheral vision. "David, look out!" 2 men rushed from behind the woodpile, clubs raised. David turned. Too late. The first blow caught him above the temple, and he crumpled to the frozen ground. Michelle's hand found the smooth grip of David's fallen colt. She drew it smoothly, just as he had taught her, keeping the barrel pointed low. "Help!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the meadow. "Fire! Somebody help us!" The attackers hesitated, seeing the gun in her steady hands. Then they turned and fled, vanishing into the brush. Michelle kept the Colt ready until she could no longer hear their retreating footsteps. "David?" She knelt beside him, touching his face with trembling fingers. Blood trickled from his temple, staining the frosted earth. "Stay with me, dear heart." The afternoon light faded as Michelle tended to him. She had managed to help him inside, where he lay on their last undamaged blanket. The roof above was scorched black, and the acrid smell of smoke clung to their ruined bedding. But Michelle focused only on David, keeping pressure on his wound with a clean cloth dot as evening approached. She sang softly to keep him conscious, her voice warm in the gathering shadows. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. David's eyes fluttered, but he squeezed her hand weakly in time with the familiar hymn. She sang every song she knew spirituals learned at her mother's knee, hymns that had carried her through dark times. Between verses, she prayed, watching David's face for any change. The temperature dropped with the sun, and she pulled their remaining blanket closer around his shoulders. "Stay awake, David," she whispered when his eyes began to drift shut. "Stay with me." She pressed the cloth more firmly against his temple, her other hand clasped tight in his, and lifted her voice once more in song. Orange embers glowed in the gathering darkness, sending thin wisps of smoke into the night air. Michelle held David's hand, her heart jumping at every sound from the shadows. Then the distinct rhythm of approaching hoofbeats broke through the evening quiet. 3 riders emerged from the gloom, their badges catching the last light. Sheriff Pike and 2 deputies. "Saw the smoke from the ridge," Pike said, dismounting. He surveyed the scorched walls, his weathered face grim. "What happened here?" Before Michelle could answer, more horses approached. Her breath caught as Rancher Tate rode up with 2 of his men, their faces hard in the fading light. "Found trouble, did you, McGraw?" Tate called out, his voice carrying a cruel edge. Pike knelt beside David, checking his wound. "He needs proper care. Boys, make up a sled, we'll take him to the Ellery place." The deputies began lashing poles together with rope. Michelle gathered their few undamaged belongings. "I'm going with him." "That won't be happening." Tate's voice cut through the cold air. He turned to Pike. "Sheriff, this woman's been stirring up the whole town, tempting violence. Look what's come of it already." "That's not true," Michelle protested. "We were attacked." "By whom?" Pike interrupted. "Got any proof?" "They came from behind," Michelle said. "In the smoke, I couldn't." "Convenient." Tate sneered. Pike sighed heavily. "Miss, until we sort this out, I'm taking you into protective custody. For your own safety, you understand." The deputies finished securing David to the makeshift sled. As they led the horses forward, Michelle tried to reach him, but Tate's men blocked her path. Pike took her arm firmly, but not roughly, leading her to his horse. The ride to town passed in a blur of shadows and starlight. By midnight, Michelle found herself behind the iron-barred door of the small stone jail, her protests falling on deaf ears. The cell was bare except for a narrow cot and a thin blanket. She sank onto the cot, shivering in the winter night. Her mother's words came back to her, clear as summer water. "If men shut doors, God opens paths." Michelle whispered the words, like a prayer, drawing strength from their familiar wisdom. Through the long cold hours, she prayed for David's recovery, for justice to prevail, for strength to face whatever morning might bring. The stone walls seemed to hold the chill, and she pulled the threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders. Before first light, the door creaked open. The jailer's wife, a thin woman with kind eyes, entered carrying a steaming cup. "Brought you some coffee," she said softly, passing it through the bars. Michelle wrapped her cold fingers around the warm tin cup, whispering her thanks. Across town at the Ellery homestead, Mrs. Ellery worked through the night tending to David. With gentle hands, she cleaned the ugly gash at his temple, washing away dry blood with warm water. Her movements were sure and practiced as she bound clean linen around his head. "Hold on, Mr. McGraw," she murmured, adjusting the bandage. "That wife of yours will need you strong." She settled into her rocking chair beside the bed, a warm Bible in her lap, keeping faithful vigil as the hours crept past. Dawn arrived with the sound of church bells floating across the silent town. Michelle stood at the small window of her cell, watching pink light touch the frost-covered panes. Footsteps approached, and Sheriff Pike appeared, looking tired. "There'll be a hearing at noon," he announced. "Judge Warren will sort out these claims." "I need to see David," Michelle said. "Please." Pike shook his head. "Can't allow that just now. Best prepare yourself to speak to the judge." After he left, Michelle sat straight back on the cot, smoothing her skirts with trembling hands. She would need every ounce of composure to face what was coming. The truth was her armor about the attack, about their legal plans for a county license, about the mission ceremony that had already joined them before God. She folded her hands in her lap, steadying her breathing as her mother had taught her, one slow breath after another, gathering her strength. When she spoke before the judge, she would let truth ring clear as those church bells, carrying across all barriers of prejudice and fear. The morning light strengthened, warming the cold stone walls. Michelle lifted her chin and began to silently rehearse her testimony, preparing to speak truth under oath. Whatever came next, she would face it with dignity and faith. The morning light filtered through the small jail window, casting weak shadows on the stone floor. Michelle sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap when the door creaked open. A young girl, no more than 12, slipped inside carrying a tin cup of water. Her eyes were wide with nervousness. "Ma'am," the girl whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Mrs. Ellery sent me. She says to tell you she speak for you at the hearing." The girl's hands trembled as she passed the cup through the bars. "Thank you, child," Michelle said softly, accepting the water. "How is Mr. McGraw?" "Still sleeping, last I saw. Mrs. Ellery's watching close." The girl darted away like a frightened rabbit as footsteps approached outside. Later that morning, a hive arrived, her gray hair neat beneath a dark shawl. The sheriff allowed her 10 minutes, watching from the doorway with arms crossed. "Sister," a hive said, reaching through the bars to grasp Michelle's hands. Her weathered fingers were warm and steady. "We will bring the mission record and witnesses. The truth must be heard." They bowed their heads together, and Have's prayer rose quiet but firm in the cold cell. "Great Spirit, guard your daughter with wisdom. Let justice flow like water through this dry land." Miles across town, in Mrs. Ellery's sunlit kitchen, David's eyes fluttered open. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and the room swam before him. Memory crashed back like lightning. The fire, the attack, Michelle's shout. "Michelle?" he called, trying to sit up. The movement sent pain shooting through his skull. Mrs. Ellery appeared beside him, pressing him gently back against the pillows. "Easy now. She's in town, in the jail. Pike's holding her for questioning." "About the fire? Jail?" David swung his legs over the bed's edge, fighting waves of dizziness. "Have to get there. And so we will," Mrs. Ellery said firmly. "But proper-like, so you don't fall and crack your head again." She steadied him as he stood, swaying. "I'll hitch the mule to my spring wagon. It'll be slow going, but we'll get you there." The journey into town tested every ounce of David's endurance. Each rut and stone in the road sent jolts of pain through his wounded head. He gripped the wagon's side, jaw clenched, focusing on one thought. Michelle needed him. The afternoon sun hung low and golden when Mrs. Ellery helped David settle onto a wooden bench outside the courthouse. Inside, the hearing was already underway. Through the open windows came Rancher Tate's carrying voice. "That spring's rightfully mine by grazing rights. And this woman, she comes here stirring up trouble, disturbing the peace of decent folk." David pressed his palms against his knees, fighting the urge to burst in. Mrs. Ellery's hand touched his shoulder, steadying him. Then Michelle's voice rose, clear and controlled. "Your Honor, we were attacked in our home. The fire was set while my husband was away fetching a wagon. We had plans to take the stage today to file our marriage license proper at the county seat." The judge's tone was measured, cautious. "These are serious claims on both sides. The matter of the spring rights, the assault, the marriage status all need proper investigation. I'll hear further testimony tomorrow after reviewing the evidence." Boots scraped on wooden floors as people began filing out. Sheriff Pike appeared in the doorway. "Miss, you'll spend one more night in the cell. For peacekeeping, you understand." David tried to stand as Michelle emerged, but his legs betrayed him. Their eyes met across the dusty street, hers steady, with love and concern, his dark with frustrated helplessness. Pike's deputies flanked her, leading her back toward the jail. The sunset painted the courthouse walls deep orange as the street emptied. David remained on the bench, one hand pressed against the rough wooden wall, his head bowed. "Lord," he whispered, "don't let me fail her now." Mrs. Ellery stood quietly beside him, her shadow long in the fading light. "Come along, Mr. McGraw. We'll get you fed and rested. Tomorrow's another day for truth to have its say." The evening settled over the town like a heavy blanket, full of unspoken prayers and promises waiting to be kept. Dawn painted the courthouse windows with pale light as townspeople filed into the cramped room. The wooden benches creaked under their weight, and whispers rustled like dry leaves. David sat near the front, his temples still throbbing, while Mrs. Ellery kept a steadying hand on his arm. Judge Harrison adjusted his spectacles and called the room to order. "We'll hear testimony regarding the McGraw matter. Reverend Fellows, approach." The minister stepped forward, twisting his hat in his hands. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the morning chill. "Reverend, did these people seek your services?" "For marriage?" the judge asked. Fellows cleared his throat. "They did, Your Honor. I declined to perform the ceremony." "On what grounds?" The minister's eyes darted to several prominent church donors in the gallery. "Given their unusual circumstances, I felt it would be improper. The school building needs a new roof, and certain supporters expressed concerns, so you refused. Based on financial pressure, not religious conviction?" The judge pressed. Fellow's shoulders slumped. "Yes, Your Honor." The hive rose next, her gray braids neat beneath her shawl. She carried herself with quiet dignity as she presented a leather-bound ledger. "This is the mission record," she explained, her voice clear and steady. "It contains their marriage ceremony, witnessed and signed. I was ordained through the Cherokee Baptist Mission in 1869. She produced weathered papers documenting her credentials. The judge examined the documents carefully. These appeared to be in order. "Mrs. Ellery, you witnessed this ceremony?" "I did, Your Honor," Mrs. Ellery confirmed from her seat. "My son Thomas witnessed as well. It was conducted proper and respectful, with prayers and vows before God." A young man in a surveyor's vest stepped forward next. "Your Honor, I'm Evan Pike, working the railroad survey. No relation to the sheriff," he added quickly. "Night of the fire, I was mapping the ridge above McGraw's place. Saw 3 men heading that way at dusk. One was Rancher Tate. They were carrying what looked like a kerosene can." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The rancher's face darkened as he half rose, but his lawyer pulled him back down. The blacksmith, Jonas Wheeler, stood up next. That same night, after dark, Tate brought his horse by. Needed a loose stirrup fixed. His coat reeked of kerosene, something fierce. Thought it strange at the time. Judge Harrison's gavel cracked against the desk. Sheriff Pike, 2 tasks for you. First, verify McGraw's spring claim at the recorder's office. Second, telegraph the county seat for clarification on 2 matters: the legal standing of mission marriages and current water rights statutes. He turned to the gallery. We'll reconvene at dawn tomorrow, once we have those answers. As deputies led Michelle back toward the jail, David tried to catch her eye. She walked tall, her face serene despite the circumstances. Outside the courthouse, several men gestured toward the saloon, offering to buy David a drink. Much obliged, he said quietly, but no, need my head clear. He turned instead to the young surveyor. Mr. Pike, would you write out what you saw that night? Sign it proper? Of course, Adam replied. He pulled a notebook from his vest and began writing in careful script. The afternoon stretched long as oil lamps were lit across town. David sat on the bench outside the courthouse, watching. Shadows lengthened across the street. His head still ached, but another pain ran deeper. Seeing Michelle led back to that cell, unable to protect her, Judge Harrison emerged as the last light faded, his face grave. Dawn tomorrow, he said, pausing beside David. We'll have the telegraph replies by then. Justice needs facts, Mr. McGraw, not just feelings, no matter how strong those feelings might be. David nodded carefully, mindful of his wound. Yes, Your Honor. Much obliged for hearing all sides. The judge hesitated, then added softly, That spring of yours, it's prime water. Railroad's coming. Some men will do dark things for such treasure. He straightened his coat, dawn sharp. Don't be late. The street emptied as night settled in. Mrs. Ellery appeared with a bowl of stew, making sure David ate despite his protests. Across town, lamplight glowed in the jail window where Michelle waited. Her soft hymns carrying on the evening air, night settled over the town like a heavy blanket, and lamplight spilled from the saloon windows onto the frozen dirt street. David straightened his shoulders, touched the crude bandage at his temple, and pushed through the swinging doors. Conversations died as he entered. The rancher, Harlan Tate, held court at the bar, surrounded by his usual followers. Smoke on, thick in the air, and a coal stove in the corner cast wavering shadows on the walls. David walked to the bar, each boot step deliberate on the wooden floor. He drew his Colt slowly, placed it on the scarred wood with the hammer down, and slid it away from himself. The barkeeper's eyes widened, but David kept his voice low and steady. You all know what fire does, he said, looking not at Tate but at the men around him. Seen enough burning in the war. This ain't about color. It's about stealing a spring and a woman's dignity. That ain't right by any measure. Tate's face reddened. You got no proof of anything, McGraw. An old miner, named Jensen, cleared his throat from his corner table. His weathered hands moved in practiced gestures. He'd lost his hearing in a blast years back, but his eyes were sharp. I do. Jensen sighed, while his drinking partner translated. Heard you bragging last week about some deal with the railroad. Stockwater contract, you said. Good money if you could get control of that spring. The saloon grew quieter still. Jensen pulled out a stub of pencil and wrote his statement on a scrap of paper, signing it with a flourish. 2 other men, shamefaced, added their marks as witnesses. David left his Colt where it lay. No need for more violence, he said quietly. Truth coming out anyway. He stepped back into the night, letting the doors swing shut behind him. Through the window, he saw several men edge away from Tate's group. Heads low in thought dotted the telegraph office, a lamp still burned. The operator, Tom Wells, hunched over his key, sending a late message at the judge's request. The wire clicked. Rapidly. Query remission ceremony status if perfected by subsequent license. Does good faith union stand? Urgent reply needed for morning hearing. Across town in her cell, Michelle sat on the narrow cot. She'd torn a corner from the newspaper. The jailer's wife had brought and was writing by the dim light that filtered through the barred window. Lord, she wrote, grant us strength to face whatever comes. Let truth prevail. Protect David's gentle heart. Her soft humming filled the small space. Amazing grace, keeping time with her heartbeat. Holding fear at bay. Near midnight, snow began to fall. Fat flakes drifted past the jail window, collecting on the sill. Michelle wrapped her shawl tighter and watched the white curtain descend, remembering her mother's words about God making all things new. The courthouse square lay empty except for David, who sat on the hard bench near the door. Mrs. Ellery appeared like a ghost in the swirling snow, carrying a thick wool blanket. You'll catch your death, she scolded gently, draping it around his shoulders. Much obliged, David murmured. But I ain't moving. Need to be here when they open up. Mrs. Ellery nodded, understanding in her eyes. That girl of yours, she's got more strength than the whole town put together. That she does, David agreed softly. That she does. The widow squeezed his shoulder and disappeared back into the night. Snow continued to fall, dusting David's shoulders and the blanket he pulled close. Around town, lanterns guttered one by one as windows went dark. The saloon fell silent. Even the wind held its breath, as if the whole town waited to see what morning would bring. David leaned back against the courthouse wall, his wounded head throbbing in time with his heart. The snow fell steadily, erasing tracks and smoothing edges, covering the town in a blank page waiting to be written. Through the jail window, Michelle's hymn carried faintly on the night air, a thread of grace in the darkness. He thought of his colt, still lying on the saloon bar, a gesture of peace when every instinct had screamed for justice. But violence would only have proved the rancher's lies about him. Michelle had shown him a better way. Dignity in the face of hatred, truth in the face of lies. Now they would trust in that truth. And in God's timing. The courthouse bell tolled midnight, its sound muffled by the falling snow. In a few hours, the telegraph office would receive its reply, and the judge would reconvene the hearing. David pulled the blanket tighter and settled in to wait, while all around him the silent town held its breath for morning. The first pale light of dawn crept over the snow-covered town. Inside the telegraph office, the machine suddenly came to life, its steady clicking breaking the morning silence. Tom Wells, who had dozed at his desk waiting for the reply, jerked awake and began transcribing the message. His pencil moved quickly across the paper. Mission ceremonies conducted in good faith are recognized by social custom. Such unions may be perfected by subsequent license filing. No statute forbids these arrangements. He read it twice to be certain, then hurried toward the courthouse where David still sat wrapped in Mrs. Ellery's blanket. Before Wells could deliver his message, the telegraph clicked again. The second wire brought equal clarity. Claim records confirmed spring rights filed by David McGraw previous summer, properly recorded and fees paid. Sheriff Pike arrived as Wells shared both messages with the judge. Pike's weathered face grew grim as he read. Reckon that shows clear motive for the fire, he said, running a hand over his jaw. I'll need a warrant, Your Honor. The judge nodded and wrote quickly. Armed with the warrant, Pike gathered a small posse. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, following tracks in the fresh snow. The trail led them to a line of bare cottonwoods along the creek, where they found Harlan Tate making hasty preparations to leave. The rancher spurred his horse, but the deep snow slowed his escape. When the posse brought him in, a dented kerosene can still swung from his saddle ties, its metal surface scratched and fuel dash stained. Michelle, heard the commotion from her cell. The jailer's wife brought her a cup of coffee and whispered the news. They caught him red-handed, trying to run. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse filled again. The judge sat at his bench, reviewing the telegraph messages and warrant return. He cleared his throat and addressed the room. Having received confirmation from the county clerk regarding the legal standing of mission ceremonies, and noting the proper recording of Mr. McGraw's water rights, this court finds sufficient grounds to proceed. He turned to Michelle. You are hereby released from custody with the court's apologies. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. As for you, Mr. Tate, you will be bound over for trial on charges of arson and assault. Bond is set at $500. As the crowd began to disperse, Reverend Fellows approached Michelle with slumped shoulders. Might I have a word with you? In private? His voice carried the weight of shame. Michelle nodded, sensing his need for forgiveness, though she was not, yet ready to grant it fully. Later, perhaps, she said softly, after I see to my husband. She stepped through the courthouse doors into the crisp afternoon air. David stood at the bottom of the steps, swaying slightly, his bandaged head bright against the winter sky. Michelle hurried down to him, sliding her arm through his to steady his balance. Thank you, Lord, David said aloud, his voice rough with emotion, for bringing truth to light. And for keeping us in your care, Michelle added, her own tears falling freely now. Sheriff Pike approached them, his badge gleaming in the winter. Son, I aim to make this right, he said, turning his hat in his hands. I'll have Deputy Barnes keep watch near your place until you can rebuild proper. Least I can do. Much obliged, David replied simply. The afternoon light was already fading when Mrs. Ellery appeared beside them. You'll come home with me tonight, she said, her tone brooking no argument. I've got stew on the stove and a warm bed made up by the kitchen fire. They walked slowly through town, Michelle supporting David's uncertain steps. The snow from the night before had begun to melt, revealing the familiar dirt of the street beneath. At the widow's house, lamplight glowed in welcome through frost-edged windows inside. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with cooking. Mrs. Ellery's son quickly laid an extra log on the fire, while his mother filled bowls with steaming stew. The boy had spread clean quilts and blankets near the kitchen stove, making a snug nest where David could rest without climbing stairs. We'll sort everything else tomorrow, Mrs. Ellery said, pressing a cup of hot coffee into Michelle's hands. For now, just eat and rest. David sank carefully onto the makeshift bed, the day's events showing clearly in the lines of exhaustion on his face. Michelle sat beside him, their shoulders touching. Outside, evening settled over the town like a gentle hand, drawing a curtain over the long day's turmoil. As evening settled over the town, lamplight glowed through the frost-edged windows of the one-room church. People filed in quietly, their boots leaving wet tracks on the wooden floor. Sheriff Pike stood near the front, his hat clutched in his weathered hands, while Reverend Fellows paced nervously before the simple altar. Michelle and David entered. Last, her arms steady around his waist as he still moved carefully from his injury. Mrs. Ellery had insisted on coming with them, and she guided them to a front pew. Sheriff Pike cleared his throat and turned to face the gathering. Miss Michelle, Mrs. McGraw, he corrected himself. I owe you a public apology. Locking you up was wrong. I let fear of trouble guide me instead of justice. His voice carried clearly in the hushed room. I aim to do better by all our citizens from here forward. Michelle nodded, accepting his words with quiet dignity. Thank you, Sheriff. Reverend Fellows stepped forward then, his usual confidence replaced by humble uncertainty. I too must ask forgiveness, he said, looking directly at Michelle and David. I let fear of losing donors for our schoolhouse roof make me forget the heart of Christ's teaching. He spread his hands. I failed to stand for what was right. All I ask, Michelle replied softly, is that next Sunday you preach about Christ's courage, about standing firm when doing right costs something. The minister bowed his head. That I will do, and gladly. A hive who had been sitting quietly in a corner rose and approached the front. Her dark eyes held wisdom as she addressed the gathering. Tomorrow morning, let us meet at the spring for a blessing ceremony. Outside, under God's sky, we can begin healing these divisions. The suggestion rippled through the crowd, heads nodding, in agreement. Even those who had been uncertain seemed drawn to the idea of a fresh start. When dawn broke the next morning, the sky stretched crystal clear above the spring. Neighbors formed a wide circle in the crisp air, their breath visible in the cold. Michelle and David stood together near the bubbling water, while a hive took her place beside them. Creator of all, a hive began, her voice carrying across the hushed. Gathering, bless this union and this water. Let both bring life to our community. Reverend Fellows stepped forward with his Bible. He opened to the book of Ruth and read in a clear voice. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. God. The words hung in the morning air like a promise. Then, from the edge of the circle came the sweet sound of a fiddle. Mrs. Ellery's son drew his bow across the strings, and the familiar notes of Amazing Grace floated over the gathering. David stepped forward, his voice steady despite his bandaged head. This spring has water enough to share, he declared. During drought, all stock will have fair access. I'll post the terms at the livery 3 cents per head for watering. Same for everyone. This practical gesture of goodwill seemed to break down the last barriers. Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith, spoke up. I reckon we could help rebuild your place. Got some spare lumber in my shop. Others quickly joined in. I've got shingles left from my barn raising, called Jim Foster, and nails too. By early afternoon, a work party had gathered at the burned cabin. Men with axes and saws cleared away the charred timbers, while others began laying out fresh lumber. Women brought baskets of food, and children carried water from the spring. The new rafters rose, strong and true against the winter sky. Seth Miller, who knew masonry, directed the building of a better chimney, explaining how the improved draw would make it safer. David worked alongside the others as much as his healing head would allow, while Michelle organized the women bringing meals and supplies. This'll be twice the cabin it was before, Mrs. Ellery observed, watching the progress. Amazing what willing hands can do. As dusk approached, Michelle lit a lantern and hung it from a new beam. Its gentle light illuminated faces that yesterday had turned away, but today showed friendship. The work party gradually dispersed as darkness fell, leaving promises to return the next day. That night, lying on pallets in Mrs. Ellery's parlor, Michelle and David reviewed their written list of materials needed for the next 3 days of rebuilding. Though their bodies ached from the day's labor, their hearts were light with gratitude. Who would have thought, Michelle whispered in the darkness, that a spring could bring such healing? David reached for her hand. The Lord works in ways we can't reckon, he replied softly, but I'm surely thankful. The list on the table beside them caught the moonlight through the window. Lumber, nails, roofing tin, window glass, each item representing another step toward their renewed home and the community's restored heart. 3 days of steady work transformed the little cabin. The new roof gleamed with fresh shingles, each row laid straight and true against the mountain wind. Between the sturdy logs, clean white chinking sealed every gap, promising warmth through the coldest nights. On the east wall, a small window now faced the spring, its glass catching the morning light like a blessing. Up on the ridge, Deputy Wilson made his evening patrol, his silhouette clear against the purple dusk. His presence, though welcome, seemed less necessary now as the town's mood had shifted from tension to acceptance. Inside the cabin, Michelle smoothed a colorful quilt across their bed, her fingers tracing the careful stitching. The fabric brought a touch of warmth to the rough-hewn walls. With reverent care, she placed the small tin cross on the shelf beside their Bible. The metal caught the late afternoon light, casting a gentle gleam across the room dotted the table. She opened her journal, the pages crisp and clean. Her neat handwriting filled the latest entry. Next week, we shall take the stage to file our license properly. The Lord has made our path straight at last. She smiled at the thought of their upcoming journey, no longer fearful but full of purpose. In town, Reverend Fellows had posted their intent to wed by county law upon their return. The notice hung prominently on the church door. It's official. Language declaring to all that David McGraw and Michelle would soon be bound by both faith and law. The minister had written it in his finest hand, as if to make up for his earlier reluctance with extra care. Now, as the sun settled toward the mountains, neighbors who had helped with the rebuilding gathered their tools and prepared to leave. David stood in the doorway, Michelle's hand warm in his. His voice carried clear and strong across the yard. "This here is my perfect helpmate," he declared, squeezing her hand gently. "God's good answer to a lonely life." The words rang with quiet joy, meant for all to hear. Michelle's eyes shone with tears of gratitude as several of the men touched their hats in respect. When twilight deepened into evening, lamplight filled their home with golden warmth. A pot of savory stew bubbled on the stove, its aroma mixing with the fresh scent of pine from the new roof beams. Michelle stirred the pot, while David set out 2 tin cups and bowls on their small table. Together, they raised their voices in a soft hymn. "Great is thy faithfulness," floating through the cabin like a gentle benediction. The familiar words spoke of God's constancy through trials, fitting for all they had endured. Kneeling side by side before their bed, they joined hands in prayer. David's voice was thick with emotion as he thanked the Lord for bringing them through fire to peace. Michelle added her own quiet words about choosing mercy over vengeance, laying down weapons to lift up grace instead. When the prayers were finished, Michelle rose and blew out the lamp. Darkness settled softly around them, broken only by starlight. Through the new window, outside, the spring's steady murmur provided a gentle lullaby, its sound promising life and continuance. The wind, so often fierce in these mountains, quieted to a whisper among the pines. Their new home held strong and sure around them. Every beam and board a testament to restored community and triumphant faith. Within its walls, they had found not just shelter, but the fulfillment of their deepest hopes, a place where love and dignity could flourish together. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.